Welcome to Misunderstood, where we talk about identity, the meaning of the word race, and explore the multicultural and multiracial experience through personal stories, candid conversations, and expert insights. I'm Hannah Lee, and I'm so glad you're here. Misunderstood is a space where stories, ideas, and research are shared for your consideration, and I encourage you to form your opinions in light of your own knowledge and experiences. My hope is that we can explore, learn, and grow together. I don't claim to have all the answers. My aim is to spark conversations around these topics. Today, we're discussing a story of sacrifice, resilience, and the lengths one woman went to in order to stay with her family. During World War II, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and incarcerated in camps across primarily Western states. In the midst of this, one woman made an unthinkable choice. Elaine Buchman Yoneda, a Jewish American, voluntarily entered one of these camps, Manzanar, to stay with her Japanese American husband Carl and their 3-year-old son Tommy. Today, I'm joined over Zoom by author Tracy Slater, who's currently in Canada, to discuss Elaine's incredible journey, explored in Tracy's upcoming book, preliminarily titled 9 Months in Manzanar, set for release in 2025 by Chicago Review Press. We'll also touch on the broader implications for interracial families during this dark time. Tracy's work has been featured online in the New York Times, the Washington Post, to name a few. You might remember our conversation in episode 29, where we discussed her touching and hilarious memoir, The Good Shufu, Finding Love, Self, and Home on the Far Side of the World. What sacrifices and impossible choices did the Yoneda family make to stay together and fight for what they believed in? Let's find out.
For me, as a contemporary woman in a mixed family, as an American, as so many different things, and just as a human, grappling with the contradictions in our identities is, I feel like, a really essential part of life. And I also feel like, as an American, looking back on that time and that period of American history where our government and our military and our politicians were completely unwilling to see an entire group of people based on ethnicity as complicated at all, but insisted on seeing people as one homogeneous kind of sinister block. The lesson to learn from that is that not only is it inaccurate not to see human beings as not just complicated but contradictory in ways. It's not only dishonest, but it's dangerous.
Welcome back, Tracy.
Thank you. It's a delight to be with you a second time. I feel very lucky that I get to speak to you twice.
I loved our previous conversation about The Good Shufu. If you guys haven't listened to it, go listen. And today we're pivoting. We're talking about your new book that's on the horizon, coming out in 2025. And before we get into all of that, we always like to start with some sort of a fact or a fun fact. And we did do your 3 fun facts in the previous episode from your personal life, but I thought maybe we could do a little fun fact that relates to your upcoming book.
Yeah, let's do that. That's more interesting.
No.
What I have here, which is interesting for me, is something that helped me kind of emotionally write the book or feel some kind of connection to the family that I was writing about, and give me maybe some sense of bravery about being able to meet this enormous task of writing about another family, of writing about a really traumatic part of American history. So what I have is, and I'll hold it up for the camera, although people who are listening won't be able to see it, but I have a piece of jewelry that belonged to Elaine Yoneda, who is the mother of the family that I'm writing about. And it was given to me by her granddaughter, Yvonne, who I have been incredibly lucky to have met and to have been able to interview in person. And I was so touched that she gave me this piece of sparkly jewelry from Elaine. When the book comes out and people read it, they'll be able to better understand how Elaine had such a sparkly personality in some ways, even though her story is difficult in other ways. And I was just very touched that Yvonne gave me a piece of her jewelry, and I kept it with me the whole time I was writing in like my computer case. So it was always with me, and it made me feel connected to both Elaine and the Yoneda descendants. And as I said, it gave me some kind of, I'm not a very spiritual person, but some kind of like metaphysical strength to try to meet the task of writing what feels like a very important story. It's much different than writing like your own memoir, right? So there's a lot more ethical pressure, I feel, the experience of writing this next book.
Wow, that is so, so special. It was like your totem, your North Star.
It was. That's a much better way to say it. I like that. It was my North Star and my totem. I like it.
When I read the premise of this book, I had chills. I was like, this is absolutely fascinating. So, how did you find out about their story?
I found out about their story in kind of an embarrassing way, I think. And that is that right after my husband and I and our kiddo, who was 4 at the time, moved to Toronto for my husband's job. And I was just thinking about what it means to be a trailing spouse, which we talked about in the previous episode. And, our kiddo was in kindergarten, and I hadn't started working on another book since my memoir came out, which was my first book. And I was struggling with what it means to give up a lot of your time and career for your family, even though at the end of the day, I don't regret it, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't hard at times. So I thought to myself, what is the most extreme version of kind of giving up your world for your spouse's world? And I started Googling about the American concentration camps because, as I said in my previous episode, my family growing up was super obsessed with the Holocaust. And so, as one does, my mind went right to, political trauma. And I thought, like, God, I wonder if there are any Jewish American wives who went into the concentration camps for Japanese Americans during World War II. That was the most extreme version I could think of in my, warped neurotic mind. So I was fascinated by the story, and it took a couple more years until I was really able to devote the time to researching this family more and this family story. But even in the interval, they never left my mind.
And from my understanding, Elaine is the only Jewish woman on record that was imprisoned in these internment camps.
Yes, in these concentration camps. Yes. The reason I don't use internment is because internment is technically a legal term for incarcerating foreigners, aliens. And one of the many astounding facts about what happened to the West Coast Japanese American community in World War II is that 2/3 of the 120,000 people who were incarcerated were US citizens. So, for 2/3 of them, it was not actually internment. For Elaine and her family, it was not internment, it was incarceration. And the idea that the Japanese American community was a foreign community was part of the oppression of that community. So that's why I don't use that term, but it is a term that has been used throughout history and is commonly used.
That's so eye opening, and I will use that as well moving forward. Speaking of these concentration camps, another layer that is so crazy about this is that Elaine was a Russian Jewish American. So her ancestors fled pogroms in Eastern Europe, and they came to the States to find safety. And here is a woman who was living a free and safe life and willingly chooses to go into one of these camps. And, as I was reading about this and learning about this story and learning about you, it's fascinating how much you have in common with the Yoneda family.
Yeah. I feel in some ways like I have a lot in common with them, and in some ways like I have very little in common with them. And both of those things really drew me to their story. So, yes, my family left the same area of Eastern Europe as Elaine's family did. My family left a generation before Elaine's, but both my family and the Buchmans were leaving because of anti-Semitism and the pogroms. And Elaine was a Jewish American woman, and I'm a Jewish American woman. And actually, Elaine grew up on the East Coast and moved to California. Their story is really a West Coast story because as adults, they were on the West Coast. And what happened to the Japanese American community in and around the camps in World War II was mostly a West Coast issue. There were East Coast people who were incarcerated in different locations, but in terms of mass removal, it was a mass removal from the West Coast. But she herself grew up on the East Coast. And when you hear her oral histories or her interviews, you can really hear like the East Coast, New York Jewish inflection. And she, will throw in Yiddish words every now and then. And it just felt very similar to my background in a lot of ways. But one of the big differences in my background and my family from the Yonedas is also sort of paradoxically what really drew me to the Yoneda story. And that is, that Elaine married a Japanese American man and my husband's Japanese. And that means that our child is the first Japanese American in our family. So when I was thinking about working on a second book, when I finally had this sort of time and mental space, I thought about what way, as a mother and as a parent and as a primary caretaker, I could kind of combine my work and my intellectual investment with something that would ultimately, hopefully, either matter to or resonate with our child as our kiddo grew up. And I thought the Yoneda story, I believe, is an important part of Jewish American and Japanese American history. And I thought, so this may not be a history that our child claims as an adult, because who knows how a kid is going to identify. But if our child does grow up to feel some connection to the Japanese American community, being the first Japanese American in our family, I wanted to feel like I had been able to combine my work with something that might sort of support that history.
There's this really surreal scene that you painted in one of the early scenes in the book about Elaine Yoneda going downtown with her mixed child and joining the line of Japanese people whose lives have just been completely turned upside down. Can you paint this picture for our listeners?
Sure. So Elaine and Tommy, hand in hand, walk through the early morning gloom of Los Angeles, get to the civil control station, and they see already very early in the morning a huge line of people already waiting. Elaine is the only white person in the line, and she and Tommy take their place. And all of a sudden, she sees an army officer and a priest running towards her, yelling at her, "Not here, not here. You shouldn't be standing in this line." And they knew she was coming because she had called and inquired and registered her disbelief that a 3-year-old was going to be taken to Manzanar. So they immediately pull her out of the line and usher her into the civil control station. And her reaction is it so perfectly encapsulates both her personality and also the different sort of pressures and privileges that are brought to bear on her story. Primarily, she feels anger that they're pulling her out of the line for two reasons. One is because they're pulling her out of the line to take her inside the civil control station to more efficiently, register her 3-year-old son to be taken to Manzanar. But also, she feels they're rolling out the red carpet for her. That's what she says, because she's white and she does not belong in a line meant for Japanese American people or Japanese people. And she's disgusted by all of it, by the racism on many different levels, and by this weird mix of privilege and trauma, really, that she's facing with either having to give over her 3-year-old son to be taken to Manzanar without her, or to have to choose to enter Manzanar with him. Although in the beginning, she keeps being told, you can't go, you can't go, it's too hard, it's not a place for you, which is another echo of this sort of weird privilege that she's given as a white mother of a mixed child. So, one of the things that is so vivid for me about that scene that I really try to communicate or evoke for the reader was not only this mix of kind of privilege and trauma that Elaine was facing, but also what was it like to be a mother on that morning facing these enormous choices and having to make split second decisions about what choices do you make? How do you navigate this totally impossible situation where none of the options are winning options?
Yes, and there was an additional major impossible split-second decision Elaine had to make regarding her family and going to Manzanar, which we will talk about later in this episode. But what about her husband? Where is he in this moment?
Her husband was one of the first people to go to Manzanar, Carl, and he actually volunteered. There were two groups of volunteers who went to Manzanar a couple of days apart once they knew that the forced removal and incarcerations were basically inevitable. It was clear that the entire West Coast Japanese American community was going to be uprooted, and they asked for volunteers to go and help build Manzanar. And many of the people who volunteered wanted to go and try to make the camp conditions as livable as possible for the rest of the community, knowing that everyone was going to be eventually incarcerated. And the volunteers were also told, your families will be the last to be taken, basically. And Carl and Elaine both assumed that neither Elaine nor Tommy would actually have to go. She and Carl were both very, very passionate about the war effort, about defeating the Nazis and defeating the Japanese imperial forces. They were communists, and the Japanese imperial government and the German government at that time were both vehemently anti communist and very anti labor, basically fascist movements. And they felt very committed to doing what they could to defeat those forces. And so Elaine really wanted to work in the war industry. Carl really wanted to enlist. He was not allowed to enlist because he was of Japanese heritage once the war broke out. And so they figured they would move to LA, live with her parents. She would work in the war industry, and they would hope to visit Carl if they were allowed to go visit camp. And then a week later, there was the announcement that anyone whose breadwinner of the family had gone to Manzanar was going to be removed and sent there. And that included anyone who had any drop of Japanese blood, basically. So, mixed race families, I think at first thought maybe they wouldn't be affected because, they were not ethnically Japanese completely, but everyone was affected.
When it came to the rules around the incarceration of the Japanese American communities, they were having a lot of trouble figuring out what box to put mixed families in. I learned a lot reading your article titled The Mixed Marriage/Mixed Blood Policy in U.S. World War II Japanese American Concentration Camps. Can you share with the listeners what this policy was about?
So the Army came up with a policy that they alternately called the mixed blood and the mixed marriage policy to try to define and police basically the mixed race families and figure out who was going to be subject to incarceration, who within these mixed families, if they were not Japanese American or Japanese themselves, what was going to happen to these relatives. And once they were in the camps, who would be eligible to apply for freedom to subsequently leave the camps after, a series of months or years of incarceration. This was a really shocking part of the history to me when I first read about it. And I was really, first of all, shocked that this had happened in history, that there was such a thing as I'll just call it the mixed blood policy for simplicity's sake, although the government used both terms to refer to the policy at different times. But I was also shocked that no one had written about this outside of a couple of academic articles because it is so disturbing and bizarre. First of all, the policy kept changing because when the policy was first conceived and released and announced, it seems the government only assumed that a mixed race family would involve a white Japanese mix. And in fact, there were many families in the camps or around the camps who were mixed, who didn't have white, or as they called them, Caucasian members of their family. There were a fair number of Chinese Japanese mixes. There were Filipino Japanese marriages. There were Mexican Japanese marriages. The West Coast was relatively multiracial at that time, especially compared to maybe other parts of the country. So when the government realized that the policy that they had set up only gave information to the camp administrators about what to do if there was a mixed white Japanese family, when they realized that, they realized they had to change the policy, because camp administrators were then saying, well, what do we do about, this family where, let's say, the husband is from the Philippines and the wife is Japanese American. The Philippines is a friendly territory. It had actually been, taken over at that point by the United States. So what do we do about these mixed families? So the policy continued to change over a series of years based on, the different ethnic mixes of the families, and also weirdly based on the different gender sort of mixes of the families. Once the families were in the camps, there were different policies for permission to apply for release for a family like the Yonedas, where the wife was white and the husband was Japanese American, versus families where the husband was white and the wife was Japanese American. The policy also changed based on what they called the quote quotient of blood of mixed race children. At first, families with mixed race children were allowed to apply for release only if their environment had been deemed Caucasian before the war, which in itself made no sense and completely confused camp administrators. And then later on throughout the war, the policy then became you could apply for release if you were a mixed race individual or a family with mixed race children who were 50% or less Japanese American blood. There was this concept of blood being tied to race, in itself a very sort of bizarre and eerie way.
So let's go back to that morning with Elaine and Tommy at the Civil Control Center in downtown LA. You were talking about what it was like being a mother that has to make a choice when none of the options are winning options. There was another major element that Elaine had to factor into her decision. Can you elaborate on this impossible choice Elaine had to make?
Yeah. So the additional sort of layer of trauma, what complicated the choice even more than the fact that Elaine was facing giving up her freedom. Because for Elaine, actually giving up her freedom did not necessarily mean what it might have meant for somebody else. Elaine had been a political activist. She had been imprisoned before for acts of political activism. But what gave it an extra sort of layer of turmoil was that in choosing to go into Manzanar with Tommy and Carl, she had to leave behind her white daughter from a previous marriage. So she basically had to choose to go into camp with one child or stay out of camp with the other. So that is a pretty chilling choice that she faced.
And how old was her daughter?
At the time, her daughter, I believe, was 12 or 13. And her daughter was living with her grandparents, so Elaine's parents. And her daughter had lived with Elaine's parents off and on throughout her life since Elaine's first marriage had ended. So Elaine's first marriage was to a white man, and they had a daughter and got divorced, and her name was Joyce. So, Elaine was not facing a choice of going into Manzanar with Tommy and leaving her daughter Joyce on the street. I mean, she had a safe place for her daughter to go. But the impact for a 12 or 13-year-old child of watching her mother make this choice between her younger half-brother and herself and leaving the family if, she wasn't actually being forced at gunpoint like the Japanese American community was. The impact of that was inarguably deeply traumatic for Joyce.
And the additional layer to this is, as you said in the article, Elaine's choice to join Carl and Tommy and Manzanar meant that she would have to, quote, waive her right to leave and conform in all respects as if they were a person of Japanese ancestry.
Yes. Non-Japanese family members who were, quote, choosing to enter the camps with their incarcerated relatives did have to waive their right to leave. That is true. That was on the form that many people were forced to sign if they wanted to enter the camp with their relatives. It's also true that you could ask for permission to leave the camp. And if you were not of Japanese ancestry, you were eligible to have that permission granted, temporary permission, as Elaine did. Joyce disappeared after a couple of months and ran away, and Elaine was able to leave the camp for a period of a few weeks, but she had to apply. She couldn't just walk out of camp. She had to apply. She was given permission. She would not have been given permission had she been Japanese American. She was given permission to leave only for a certain number of weeks. She was under curfew. She didn't just accompany her child and her husband to camp. She became an incarceree, although an incarceree with access to unique privileges. Both of those things are true.
And she was an outsider in this camp. Here are these group of people that have just been through major trauma. And then there's this white Jewish woman that is a communist and whose husband is trying to enlist. And it was creating a lot of tension in the camp, right? And tell us a little bit of how they were treated while they were in the camp.
Well, one of the things that I hope to accomplish in the book is not only to kind of uncover the history of the mixed race population that was in and around the camps, and to show that the people who were incarcerated in the American concentration camps during World War II were not a homogenous group, even though the government insisted that they were a homogenous group, and that because they were of Japanese blood or Japanese descent, that the Japanese race was the enemy race, is what one of the major army officials said, and therefore everybody needs to go, everyone needs to be locked up. But in fact, the population was quite heterogeneous, not only ethnically. There were an awful lot of different political opinions. There's a lot of generational divides within the camps. There was a lot of different levels of citizenship in the camp because the elders, who for the most part had migrated to the US, were not allowed to become citizens, unlike Italian and German immigrants who were white. You were not allowed to become a citizen if you were Japanese in the early 20th century, if you were Asian, basically. So the younger generation in the camp, Carl and Elaine and Tommy included, were American citizens. And a lot of the people in the camps were not American citizens. Most, I would say, certainly many, not because they chose not to be, but because they weren't given the chance to become an American citizen. So there was a real political diversity among people in the camps. And there was also a real diversity, as anyone would expect, of kind of survival mechanisms for getting through this situation. And Elaine and Carl, because of their ethnic mix as a family, I believe, and because of their political past and their political passions, were very vocal about supporting any fight against the fascists. They believed that the forced removal and incarceration of the West Coast Japanese American community was a civil rights violation. They believed that, but they did not believe that the time to protest that was until after the fascist forces were defeated. And so they made the decision they were going to go along with the incarceration and try to make the best of it until after the war. And then they would, try to hash out what the US government had done to its own citizens. And I think they really felt, it's hard now to look back, now that we know what happened and who won the war, it's hard now to remember how scary it must have been for everybody to not know whether or not the Axis was going to win. I mean, at this point in early 1942, the Axis were winning. And, Elaine's distant relatives who had not immigrated to the US and who'd stayed behind in Eastern Europe, nobody knew exactly what was happening to them because the details about the Nazi concentration camp, the Nazi extermination camps actually weren't concentration camps. They were extermination camps. The Nazis used concentration camps as their own euphemism. But the truth of the extermination camps hadn't really come out yet, but people knew that the Jews were being mass murdered. And both the Japanese and the German government had long had severe violent repression of communists as well in both of their countries. In fact, the original people who were concentrated in camps in Germany were communists. So they were terrified of what would happen if the Allied forces didn't win the war. So anyway, they decided they needed to, above and beyond, support the American war effort. And because of their personalities and the fact that they had given up everything. I mean, Elaine's family was not in the camp, so they had actually lost, in some ways, materially less than a lot of people had, although their family was fragmented because Elaine, was now separated from her daughter. But, they had given up a lot, as everybody had. And the thing that they had to hold on to was their political activism. And so they were very loud and assertive about the need to put the war effort above everything, even above the protests of the US camps. And there were many people in the US camps who, I think understandably, from where they were sitting, from their own perspective, who didn't want to just sit there and, accept what was happening and say, well, we're going to wait until the war ends if it ever ends. And maybe we're not as personally threatened by what was happening with the war as Elaine and Carl were. And so Elaine and Carl's fears and political activism and very vocal commitment to supporting the American government and the American war effort above everything else, that put them on a collision course with some other people in the camp who felt that what they needed to do to kind of save their own souls and the only thing they had left, which was their chance to fight against injustice, was to protest what was happening to the Japanese American community. So it became a kind of like a powder keg in Manzanar. People had fought in World War I, and now their country was talking about taking away their citizenship. And not only that, but had locked them up and forced them to sell or give away all of their property. So there was a lot of tension in the camps between the different ways that people dealt with their incarceration, and it became violent.
I think Carl's situation was really interesting because he was essentially betraying both Japan and his Japanese people in the States, his fellow Japanese Americans, and him wanting to go and serve. The book mentions that he does end up getting drafted at one point.
He volunteers. I mean, many people from the camps volunteered, but he was one of the first to volunteer to go fight in the war. He was in military intelligence. He was fighting in the Pacific War.
It's such a tough place to be in. He was determined to sort of not look at the labels and look at the bigger picture and look at people as humans and not as, well, you're from this country or you're from this country, or like, what does this boil down to and what are my values? And it came at a great cost. I mean, it came to a point where his life was at risk. He was on a hit list, essentially, right?
His name was put on a death list.
Yeah. And when he went to war, the next best thing they could find was their son, Tommy.
Yeah, there were people who told Elaine that Tommy was put on the death list in sort of as proxy for Carl. I mean, it was definitely a very scary time. There's a natural narrative arc to their story. So there is a kind of an explosive climax that happens in the camp. Yeah, I mean, going back to what you were saying earlier, Carl did not identify as Japanese. He identified as Japanese American. I don't think he felt really any loyalty to Japan, except his parents had moved back to Japan. His parents were born in Japan, moved to the US. He was born in the US. Then they moved back to Japan because they couldn't make a living in the US. So his mom was in Hiroshima during the war, and he felt terrified about what was going to happen to her. And he felt connection to Japan, to his cultural heritage to an extent, and also to the Japanese people, but he felt no loyalty to the Japanese government. He escaped Japan because he didn't want to serve in the Imperial Army well before World War II. So he had hated the sort of Japanese imperial government for a long time. I think what he and Elaine, what their story taught me is that they were uniquely able, I think, to embrace all the different contradictions in their identities. He was Japanese American. He felt very clearly that the Japanese government was oppressing the Japanese public, but he really wanted to fight against the Japanese government. Elaine was an extremely strong woman, very assertive, very passionate, very active, but at one point said she did not identify as feminist. She was an incredibly devoted mother in many ways. She chose to enter Manzanar to stay with Tommy, who had a lot of health issues. Actually, this is another aspect of the story. Manzanar was a very physically threatening place to Tommy. He had very severe asthma, and he was extremely ill from being in the desert. So she chose to kind of enter Manzanar to stay with Tommy and to be with her husband. Although I think the idea of the mixed family members choosing to be with their families is itself complicated, because if you take someone's child, someone's 3-year-old, you're not really being given a choice. You're certainly not being given any humane choice. Do you let your child be taken to a concentration camp without you, or do you go with them? It's sort of like there was a choice, but there was not any kind of fair choice. But she was incredibly devoted to her son in that way, but she also left behind her daughter. And she had a very complicated relationship with her daughter, which was not helped at all by the forced separation. So anyway, both Elaine and Carl were very complicated people, but they kind of embraced their complications in a way, and they embraced, I feel, the way in which human life and human identity and human society is full of these real contradictions, and that in order to kind of live a full and ethical life, we have to somehow encompass all of these contradictions. We may not do it gracefully all the time. There were things that Carl and Elaine really regretted after the war. And there were things that they didn't regret, but they at least admitted it. They admitted everything. And I feel like for me, as a contemporary woman in a mixed family, as an American, as so many different things, and just as a human, grappling with the contradictions in our identities is, I feel like, a really essential part of life. And I also feel like, as an American, looking back on that time and that period of American history where our government and our military and our politicians were completely unwilling to see an entire group of people based on ethnicity as complicated at all, but insisted on seeing people as one homogeneous, kind of sinister block. The lesson to learn from that is that not only is it inaccurate not to see human beings as not just complicated, but contradictory in ways. It's not only dishonest, but it's dangerous if we're not open to the contradictions in our identity, in our society, in our lives, in our humanity.
Well, I learned so much talking to you today and reading the materials you have. I'm so excited for this book to come out, to learn more about the Yoneda family and about the mixed families that were incarcerated. This book is going to be coming out in 2025. There's also a bunch more information on your websites, previous articles you've written. Is that the place to send people to find out more?
Yeah, so there's a link to the main article that I wrote about the mixed marriage policy. Actually, 2 articles that I wrote, one for the Japanese American organization Densho, and one for Time Magazine Online's Made by History site about the mixed marriage policy. Both of those are available on my website, which is just tracyslater.com. And there's also a page that I have put up on the website that is linked to my social media, to both Instagram and Twitter, and you can find those handles on the website. But where I post information, not solely, but particularly about the families who were mixed race, who were impacted by the camps, who were not just white Japanese mixes, because it feels important to me to do, because, as I said, the initial assumption on the government's part was that mixed race families who would be impacted by the camps were all going to be white Japanese mixes, and that was not true. And that was its own sort of form of ignorance and racism, that assumption. And I realized that although I think the Yoneda story is incredibly important and incredibly fascinating, I don't want to be adding to any assumption that the stories of mixed race families in and around the camps that are, important are only the white Japanese mixes. So I try to post what little information I've been able to find from government records about other families that encompass different ethnic backgrounds.
That's great. So I will also put all the links in the show notes. And while we wait for your book to come out, is there anything that you would like to recommend to our listeners to watch or read?
There is actually a little suggestion that I wanted to give for people who are interested in learning more about the Japanese American incarceration and concentration camps. There's a book that recently came out that is an anthology. The title is The Literature of Japanese American Incarceration. It came out in spring 2024, and it was edited by Frank Abe and Floyd Chung, and it collects both fiction and nonfiction written by people who were incarcerated during World War II in the camps. And I think it's just a really valuable addition to American history and a really valuable resource for anybody who wants to learn generally more about voices from the camps and the experience of many different kinds of people who are incarcerated.
Thank you. If you guys enjoyed this episode, if you learned something new, please share it. Share it with as many people as you can. Also, follow the podcast, leave a review, rate the podcast. That would all be really helpful. There's also a Patreon if you want to support the podcast and the work we're doing. And if you want to add anything to this conversation, or if you have questions, please write to me at mixunderstoodpod@gmail.com. You can also leave a message. Do you have a story and you want to share it with us? You can leave me a voicemail at 323-524-8662. And as always, I'm on social media at mixunderstoodpod on Instagram or even TikTok, guys. So come say hello. Very active over there. And that's it. Tracy, it was such a pleasure to have you for these 2 episodes. And I wish we could do more. So are we gonna do a third one at one point?
We gotta wait until my third book, so it might be a while. There was 10 years between the first one and the second one, so but it's been a real delight to talk to you, and your questions have really made me think, and really gotten to the heart of, I think, what's really important about this history, and also really relevant to so many people today in the United States. The mixed race population is the fastest growing demographic, and that's exciting, at least for me, and as part of a mixed race family. So
yes, and I think it's such a beautiful gesture towards your kid, and I hope many future Japanese American kids will find value in learning about these families' stories. Well, thank you, Tracy. It was really, really special and important to have you here today. And I guess it's time to say goodbye. So on that note, bye, Tracy.
bye.
This episode was produced by me, music by Matthias Kunzli.